All right, good morning and happy Friday. I know we were talking about it's been a long week, so I know many of you have been back to school this week, and I appreciate you taking some time out to join us at this time. Kelly, you were asking about a handout. I have something I've been, just handing out to people with any changes. I'll get that cleaned up and put on the RSA coordinator page for us this weekend so that you'll have access to that. My name is Melissa Ahlgrim. I'm the Director of Reading Sufficiency, and we are going to talk this morning about RSA, or Reading Sufficiency. This is a repeat of the session that we had at Engage this summer. So just so you're aware, it's not necessarily new information. It's just good information to make sure that we're all up on. At the same time, we are going to discuss any legislative updates that have occurred this year. So my contact information is right there. My email is the easiest way to get a hold of me. Obviously, we are all very, very busy sometimes. And sometimes I can get a hold of that when I'm not at my desk because I keep that and try to monitor that frequently. Also, the social media pages we always try to make people aware of that we can use to get out information as well as networking across the state. These are not pages that I run, but I certainly do try to post a lot of information or answer questions on those pages. So our goals for our session this morning are to make sure that we understand the requirements for kindergarten through third grade students under the Reading Sufficiency Act, as well as ensure that we can describe those 4 pathways for promotion under RSA. We also want to make sure that we have that documentation that is required, as well as any ongoing requirements under the RSA. And as I mentioned before, discussing any legislative updates that occurred. Senate Bill 601 was signed by Governor Stitt this last spring, and it has caused a few changes, hopefully for the best, under RSA that we need to make sure that we are aware of. So the purpose of RSA, this is not a new law. We had some questions about that, some people thinking some of these changes were actually a new law. This has been around since 1997, and the purpose has not really changed in that amount of time. It is still to ensure that each child has the necessary reading skills by the end of 3rd grade that will enable them to continue their development of reading skills. So we're talking about foundational reading skills. We need to ensure that students have these because this is when we are focusing on them in the K through 2 grades. Our 3rd grade is really the end of a long race. And I've had several conversations with teachers and principals the last few weeks thinking that this is still a 3rd grade law. This is really a K2 law with 3rd grade kind of being the end game. So we need to ensure that we're focusing in on those early grades. So when we talk about early reading instruction, we all start with a reading plan. The reading plan is currently open on single sign-on. It is due August 30th. We've already started reviewing those plans. Every school that works with kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, or 3rd grade students must complete the reading sufficiency plan. This lets us outline what we're going to do for instruction for all students, as well as for students who are struggling, how we will assess students to determine what their needs are and how we can see if they're responding to that instruction, as well as how we would spend any funding that we receive. RSA is fully funded for the very first time this year, and it's important that we are identifying what we're going to spend those funds on. And we need to get these plans done. We have about 975 sites that have to complete an RSA plan. We read every single plan, and we cannot disperse any RSA funds until all plans have been approved. So it's very important that we get those in. And I'm stressing this because I know I've got probably about 300 districts that it's still saying not started on our report. So if you're one of those, please get in there and get started on your reading plan. So in our reading plan, we first start identifying what our core program or Tier 1 instruction would be. This is where if we need to make sure that we're reaching the needs of all of our students. This has on grade level instruction, and it is for a minimum of 90 minutes a day. It must be a scientifically research-based program. Now, a lot of times when we have a lot of kids struggling, we're wanting to first focus on what do we do for intervention. But many times if we have a lot of kids struggling, we need to focus in on our tier 1 and make sure that that core instruction is solid, that we are getting in what we need to do to best meet the needs of our students, because we cannot intervene our way out of weak tier 1 instruction. We just simply don't have enough time or resources or personnel. So if we're noticing that we've got a lot of kids struggling, that's where we want to really focus in and make sure that we have a good, well-rounded core instruction that's dealing with all areas of reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, as well as comprehension, um, and meets best practices in all those areas. For interventions, for students who are not having their needs met, these are usually kiddos that are about 6 to 12 months behind their peers. We would label them with Tier 2 interventions. The interventions are in addition to, not in place of, Tier 1 instruction, and it's based on the specific needs of that student. So if you have a third grader that's really struggling with sounding out words, they need to have phonemic awareness or phonics instruction, as opposed to a third grader who might be struggling with basic comprehension but has very accurate word reading. They need either a vocabulary or comprehension intervention. So we can't have just the same intervention for a grade level, because it needs to be based on the needs of the student. Likewise, the time for that intervention is based on those needs. So an intervention in phonemic awareness or phonics might take much less time, as opposed to a comprehension intervention that you have to have time to read a text and have those conversations. For students that are well below their peers, more than a year behind their peers, that's usually where we pull in a Tier 3 intervention. These are very intensive interventions, and it again is based on the specific needs of a student. These are in addition to, not instead of, Tier 1. So legally, 45 to 60 minutes of additional daily instruction is required on top of the 90-minute core on grade level instruction. Okay, so for assessments, it's important to make sure that we know what our kids know and who is needing some additional help. So we start off with universal screening. All students in kindergarten through third grade do need to be universally screened. And the purpose is really just to identify students who are at risk for reading difficulties. All does mean all, so we do screen all students. We do this 3 times a year: beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year. The middle of year requirement is new this year in legislation, although it is best practice, and most of our districts have been doing a middle of year screen all along anyway. We do not anticipate a new data collection or state report for the middle of year. We will only do the ones that we've done at the beginning of year, which is due October 1st, and the one at the end of year, which is due May 31st. Again, that beginning of year report due October 1st is the other half of requirement that we need from all sites in order to be able to distribute any RSA funds. So last year we had about 5 schools that we were still kind of waiting on to get one of their reports, either beginning of year or reading plan, done, and it was holding up funding for the entire state, because I know several of you have probably contacted me saying, where's our funding? So please don't be one of those schools. Let's make sure we get those in on time. The state board's screeners, the state board has approved 7 different screeners. They approved these last June in 2018. We went through a review to ensure that the assessments listed were actually screeners. That was not always the case with the previous list, as well as met all 5 requirements. That would be that it is identified as a screening assessment with the purpose of identifying at risk or not at risk. That means not a diagnostic assessment, which would be more in-depth. It also had to have strong reliability and validity. We wanted to make sure it was doing what it said it would do and that it was doing it accurately. It had to provide reports in all ways specified under legislation at the student, class, and grade level, as well as school. And finally, it had to have accommodations for students with special needs as well as EL students. And finally, it had to assess all 5 areas of reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Now, there was an update to this list after the board approval that the board did have to reconsider this last spring. We had on here previously Dibbles Next, and Dibbles Next, the 2 companies that were working with Dibbles Next split in a lawsuit that we were not aware was taking place during our initial review, and this last fall, and the 2 companies now are providing these assessments, but they have a little bit different name. So Dynamic Measurement Group is now called Acadience. This is the old paper pencil version Dibbles Next. It's the same test, it just has a new name. So that's one I'm getting a lot of questions on lately. We're still using the Dibbles Next. It says Dibbles Next on our test. Yes, that's fine. Do make sure that you're keeping up with all of the subtests that are required. We'll point to that in just a moment. And then the online version, the M-Class by Amplify, has now created a new test. They were allowed to keep the name, but they created a new test called Dibbles 8th Edition. So we have old test with new name and new test with old name. Not confusing at all. The other thing that we get a little question about is STAR Early Learning. The early learning is the umbrella term for both the early literacy and the STAR reading tests. So both are included in that battery. Okay. Now this is just an update. Earlier this week, we posted technical guidance for each of these screeners. So you can find this on the RSA Coordinator page. If you'll scroll down a little bit down the page, you can click on any of our assessments and you'll find out what are the subtests that are required for that, as opposed to what might just be recommended or nice to have, as well as the scores that meet what's described for proficiency or for RSA at all periods of testing time for all grade levels K through 3. So hopefully that will be some help for many of you. Also under RSA, once we have students that we've identified that are at risk, we might also give them a diagnostic assessment. And a diagnostic assessment, we're not talking about a full-on evaluation by a school psychologist. What we're talking about is let's go dig a little deeper to see what skills that student is strong in and where they might still have some weaknesses. Things that might qualify for diagnostic assessment include a phonics survey, a phonological survey, a spelling inventory, writing samples. All of those things are just general terms that allow us to know where are our skills that we're struggling with that we might need to be able to address the needs of these students. These take a little bit more time, which is why we don't necessarily want to give them to every single student in our class because of the amount of time it takes to give these. But when we are giving that screening assessment and finding our students who are at risk, then the diagnostic assessment helps us determine what exactly that student needs. And then finally, under progress monitor, and this is generally used with our screening assessment because these have a sensitivity to them that we are able to assess students more often and still see changes that are occurring. So when we monitor the progress of students who are receiving intervention, we want to make sure that we know that they're having growth. It's especially important for students when we're asking them to miss out on other instruction because those interventions do take time if it's on top of the 90-minute block. And it's we want to make sure that they are making the progress and that it's worth the time that we're asking them to spend on those interventions. If we're not seeing the progress, we need to quickly be able to change that intervention. It is recommended that students at a Tier 2 level would be monitored on a monthly basis and that students on a Tier 3 level would be monitored weekly. Again, that's a 45 to 60-minute additional instruction requirement, so we should be seeing quick growth on that weekly basis. Okay, so for students who are showing that they are at risk, it is required that any student in kindergarten through 3rd grade who's assessed and not meeting those grade level targets should be provided with a program of reading instruction. We call this an academic progress plan or an APP. And this is designed to enable the student to acquire appropriate grade level reading skills. We want to close that gap, and we want to close it very early while we still have that opportunity to do so. So the program of reading instruction must align with the Oklahoma academic standards, and it may include, but is not limited to, some sufficient additional in-school instructional time for the acquisition of reading skills, as well as tutorial instruction either before school, during school hours, during the summer, or on Saturdays, and it outlines which assessments we would use for diagnostic purposes as well as monitoring. We do have updated examples of the APP on the OSDE website for kindergarten, first, second, and third grade so that you can see what is required in that APP. These are downloadable as Word documents so that you can take off the draft box so you can put your own school logo or make any slight adjustments that might need to be made. Now, kindergarten did see some changes in Senate Bill 601 this year. Kindergarten students will be screened at the beginning, middle, and end of year, as we talked about previously. However, we had some discrepancies in how districts were interpreting when students in kindergarten might need to be put on a plan. We had some districts that were assessing students, but then waiting until first grade to provide any type of intervention or put them on a plan, and that was causing students to wait for a full year if they were truly struggling. At the other end, we had districts that would assess students and immediately place them on a plan, and that was their interpretation as well. And the first conference that we might have with a kindergarten parent was, "Hi, welcome to school, your child is failing." And that's not generally a way we want to greet our parents at the beginning of the year. So with this, we cleaned up that language in Senate Bill 601 to state that we would still assess kindergarten students at the beginning of the year and take note of students who might be struggling and make sure that we're providing them good core beginning instruction. When we assess students again at the middle of the year, if they are still struggling, then we would place kindergarten students on a plan. I've had a couple of districts that say we have very robust pre-K programs. We would really like to go ahead and continue putting them on the plan at the beginning. That's fine. The minimum requirement then is that we would place students, kindergarten students, on a reading plan by mid-year at the latest, but it does give districts a little bit of latitude to be able to delay that until mid-year if they feel that that's what is appropriate. Now, districts, what this will mean for you is that you will have to ensure that you have a way of getting parents in after that mid-year assessment for a conference if they need to sign off on an academic progress plan. So please be aware of that when planning out your calendar. And again, it is required that we would monitor progress of students throughout the year, especially if they are receiving any type of intervention. First and second grade did not see any changes in legislation. If students are assessed again at the beginning, middle, and end of year, and anytime if they are found not to be meeting grade level targets, then they would receive any supplemental instructional services as designed through their academic progress plan or APP. Beginning in first grade and continuing through second and third, the APP is developed by a student reading proficiency team, which means that the parent or guardian, the current teacher responsible for reading, as well as a teacher in the next grade level familiar with that reading instruction, would need to sign off on the APP, as well as a certified reading specialist if one is available. So how this might look in reality is if I am a first grade teacher, I have a student in my classroom who's struggling, I would write out their APP. I need to go confer with my second grade colleague across the hall so that we can ensure that our plan is going to get them where they need to be at a reasonable time. And then we have our parent come in for our conference to sign off on that. And again, if I have a reading specialist on staff, I certainly want to utilize their expertise. In third grade, again, students are assessed beginning, middle, and end of year, and if at any time they are found not to be meeting grade level targets, they would have a plan, an APP, as well as receive any intensive accelerated reading instruction, which may include specialized tutoring. Also, whenever we notice that a third grade student is not meeting those grade level targets on their screening assessment, we would immediately begin a student reading portfolio, which can eventually be used to meet Good Cause Exemption 4 at the end of the year. And again, just a reminder, the APP in third grade is developed by the Student Reading Proficiency team, the parent, guardian of the student, a third grade teacher responsible for reading, a fourth grade teacher also responsible for reading, and a certified reading specialist if one is available. Okay, moving on to third grade and those decisions when we talk about at the end of the year. It is very important for us to remember that the pathways are designed to allow for the best decision for each individual student, and that we would never decide on promotion or retention decisions based on a single score. We have a lot of data that we collect on our students, and we need to make sure that we are utilizing all of that data to make that best decision. So our pathways for promotion in third grade up to fourth grade is 1, to meet RSA criteria on the third grade state reading test. 2 is to show proficiency on one of the state approved screeners that we discussed earlier. 3 would be to meet one of the 7 good cause exemptions. And finally, a unanimous decision to promote through the Student Reading Proficiency team. Under Pathway 1 for the RSA criteria, all third grade students receive 2 scores for measured progress on the Oklahoma State Testing Program, or OSTP. One is the overall performance that all students 3rd through 8th grade get from the OSTP, which is either advanced, proficient, basic, or below basic. And the other is an RSA criteria score, and it will simply say meets or does not meet. Now, RSA criteria is only based off of about 70% of the test, which is standard 2, reading and writing processes, things like a main idea, detail, supporting ideas, genre. And then standard 4, which is vocabulary, things like understanding just basic vocabulary knowledge, using word parts, word relationships, or context clues. Because the goal is different for RSA criteria, as well as the amount of material that's used to determine that score, those 2 scores do not line up. We will have students that are scoring below basic that may still meet RSA criteria. About 1/3 of students that scored below basic still met RSA criteria. We had a few, less than 1% of students that scored basic that did not meet RSA criteria. And again, all students who scored proficient or advanced did meet RSA criteria. When determining retention or promotion decisions for third grade, it is only the RSA criteria score that is used. So for that student that scored below basic but did meet criteria, they are eligible for automatic promotion under RSA. Pathway 2, proficiency on the screener. Any first, second, or third grade student who shows end-of-year third grade proficiency on a state-approved screener is exempt from retention under RSA. This can be met at any time during the year, either during universal screening or progress monitoring, and can be met with any approved screener. So for example, I have a couple of districts who have said they utilize one screener for what they report their numbers on, but they also have a second screener that they might use maybe with their special education class or a pull-out class. And if a student meets it on either one of those, as long as both are on the approved list, that qualifies for this pathway for promotion. Those technical guidance documents that I showed you earlier do identify the score, and it does show the end of year third grade proficiency score, which is bolded and highlighted for your convenience to ensure that you know what that number might be. On some tools that are what we call computer adaptive tools, such as the STAR is one and iStation is another, that they might it is possible that a first or second grade student might be able to reach that end of year third grade score because it takes them on the different paths depending upon their answers. Other tools, which are what we call curriculum-based measures, such as Acadience or AimsWeb Plus, they have different set of materials that they use for each grade level. So it would be a little more difficult for a first or second grade student to reach that third grade score because they would have to be given third grade materials, which is not something we normally do in a screening process. So do be aware that that is there. For some, that'll be a little easier to attain than others. For Pathway 3, good cause exemptions, we have 7 good cause exemptions. There are a couple of changes to these through Senate Bill 601 as well. EL students, English language learners who have had less than 2 years of instruction in an English learner program are exempt from retention, and regardless of their score on the state test, are eligible for promotion to 4th grade. Students who participate in the Oklahoma Alternate Assessment Program, or the OAP, also sometimes known as the Dynamic Learning Map, or DLM, regardless of their score on that assessment, are eligible for promotion to 4th grade and are exempt under Exemption 2. Students who demonstrate an acceptable level of performance in an alternative standardized reading assessment, this could be the ITBS, the SAT-10, or the Terra Nova. This usually is better for students who might normally do well, but have just really had a rough week. Maybe they had the flu the week before school, before our testing week started, and they're still just not feeling great. We can give them an alternative test and see how they do on that. Exemption 4 are for students who demonstrate a teacher developed portfolio that they can read on grade level. The requirements for this portfolio can be found on the RSA Coordinator website. I'm going to skip down to Exemption 7, which is students who are approved by the Office of Assessment due to exceptional emergency circumstances. And these are pretty severe circumstances that are usually approved. And your district testing coordinator would have the form to fill out that would apply for that exemption. Now, coming back to Exemption 5, this is one that saw a change this last spring. It is students who have an IEP and have made adequate progress towards their IEP goals. What this does is it removes the requirement for a previous year's retention for IEP students. So starting this coming year, students who have an IEP and have made adequate progress, and adequate progress would be determined by the district and the IEP team of what that would look like, then they are eligible for promotion under Exemption 5. Exemption 6 also saw a change. It states that students who have been previously retained in pre-K for academic reasons, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, or 3rd grade, are now eligible for promotion to 4th grade. The change here is that it removes the 2nd year of retention that was previously required. So now it is for students who have been retained once that do not have an IEP. Also, in this case, any transitional class would count as a year retention. So if a student went to kindergarten, a transitional 1st or T1, and then 1st, the T1 class counts as that year retention. These changes went into effect July 1st, and it starts with effect for this year's 3rd graders. It did not backtrack to affect last year's 3rd graders. And finally, our last pathway is our probationary promotion. Students may receive an approval for probationary promotion from the student reading proficiency team, and then it has to be approved by the school principal and the district superintendent. So the members of this team are the 3rd grade teacher who is responsible for reading instruction, a 4th grade teacher also responsible for reading instruction, and the parent or guardian of the student, and a reading specialist if one is available on staff. So this team would decide to meet, and they would want to consider all data available. And this would include classroom data, progress monitoring, progress towards IEP goals, or if they're on the WIDA, taking any WIDA scores, attendance. The team might decide to say, you know, this student has had a 40% absence rate. This is probably a reason that we might want to consider, is this really the best idea for this child to move forward, or have they just missed a lot of instruction? The progress monitoring data is really important in this case. We might say that that child is not quite on grade level, but they have been making amazing gains, and we think that they can continue those gains, and so that might be a reason that we consider promotion. In any case, the decision to promote must be unanimous, not the decision to retain. So all members of that committee must agree that promotion is best for that child to be promoted to 4th grade. If anyone disagrees and feels that retention is the case, then that's where we stop. And that's the end of our flow chart here. We've tried all avenues. We are now retaining. So, of course, I'm sure administrators, you get a lot of calls. I do as well, from parents who are saying, I don't agree. I don't want my child retained. In this case, if they are the only one that is saying, I don't want them retained, but the school is recommending retention, it does override the parent in this case. So just to be aware of that. Okay, for students who are retained, we do not want to just say, go do 3rd grade again and good luck. They have been retained for a reason, and we have an obligation to address their needs. So students who do not meet RSA criteria, who are not subject to a good cause exemption, who do not qualify for probationary promotion shall be retained, and provided intensive instructional services and supports. So what we often find are, for those 3rd grade students, they take that beginning of year screening again for their 2nd time in 3rd grade, and they score higher sometimes because they are now a year older and they're usually able to do that. Regardless of that, they still need intervention for whatever reason it was that we retained that student. There is a 3rd grade promotion retention report. It is new this year. I do know there have been quite a few headaches with that, and I'm just going to apologize up front. We're still working on it, actually. It is now located on the Wave. It is due October 31st, and what this report does is, rather than just saying our numbers of students that we are promoting in different ways or retaining, we are now listing each student who did not meet criteria on the state test and what the decision was for that child. This is going to hopefully help us as we have students moving back and forth between different districts to make sure that they are not getting lost in the shuffle, as well as help us be able to determine what is working. Is the committee promotion helping for students? Are those students still continuing on in school and graduating with their peer group? What about students who are being retained or being promoted through exemption? So it's helping us kind of evaluate what's going on with RSA, as well as helping us communicate between districts. So I do appreciate your patience with this report. We are still working on getting the kinks laid out of it. The feedback I'm hearing is, once we can get past some of the technological issues, it's really going to be much more helpful for us. Okay, any ongoing requirements? Oh, students who are being retained must be provided with a high-performing teacher. They must also receive intensive instructional services and support, as we discussed previously. They are still involved in a 90-minute uninterrupted reading block, as are all 3rd graders, and any additional strategies prescribed by the district. In addition, students who are retained must receive at least one of the following: either some supplemental tutoring, either before, during, or after school. They could get a parent-guided read-at-home assistance plan. There is one located on the RSA website under the family page. Or they could have a mentor or tutor with specialized reading training. For students who are promoted through exemption or through the Student Reading Proficiency Team Committee, these students are still exhibiting issues. They are still struggling, which is why they are promoted in an alternative way, which means that even though they are in 4th grade, they would still need to have an academic progress plan and be receiving intensive reading instruction that includes specialized diagnostic information and any reading strategies until that student meets grade level targets in reading, and that would be measured through a screening instrument. In addition, for students who are promoted through that Student Reading Proficiency Team or committee, remember that is a probationary promotion, and so the committee would continue to review the reading performance of that student each academic year and determine if promotion is best or if that student might need to be retained. And they would continue this until that student demonstrates grade level reading proficiency, again on a screening instrument, not the state test, for the corresponding grade level in which that student is enrolled. After 5th grade, then we would transition to a locally designed remediation plan. It no longer falls under state law. Then the onus is on the districts to determine what that remediation plan would look like after 5th grade for those students. So a couple of frequently asked questions that we get. What if they moved after taking the test? The district that administered the test is the one responsible for determining the appropriate promotion pathway or retention. So if you have a student that was with District A and they took their test and then right after the testing window, they moved to District B. District A is going to fill out what's going on. Now, District B at that point may have that student in a summer school program. They may be doing an end of summer promotion or a mid-year promotion, are able to make those adjustments. But it does start with District A where they took the test. What if they didn't take the 3rd grade test? If they were not enrolled in an Oklahoma public school during the testing window, then RSA does not apply. So this would include students who attended 3rd grade out of state, they were in a private school, or they were homeschooled. They are not required to take the state test. So in that case, for these students, when they come to enroll as 4th graders, you would follow your district procedures for grade level placement, just as you would for a student in any other grade. If they did not take the 3rd grade test, but they were enrolled, maybe they were just absent during the testing window or refused to test, then that student did not meet RSA criteria, in which case they would need to have an alternate pathway for promotion or be retained, whichever is deemed appropriate. Okay, so let me see, a couple of things. Are these exemptions only if they received or attended the intense remediation? Several of the exemptions do state in legislation that they are required to have 2 years of intervention in order to be eligible for that exemption. So I believe that is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exemption, I think that language was taken out of Exemption 5 when it was revised. But Exemption 6 does state that a student who has been received 2 years of intensive remediation as well as been previously retained would be Exemption 6. When a 3rd grade student is promoted to 4th with a good cause exemption, is that student considered probationary promotion? Probationary promotion is really only applied for students that are promoted through a committee. The good cause exemption, it's not a probationary, they were just exempt. However, we would still want to remediate the areas that caused them. So if we have an EL student that they met Exemption 1, obviously they need to continue with EL services. Or if we have an IEP student that met either Exemption 2, because these are students that are deemed profound enough that they need to take the OAP, or through Exemption 5, they as well need to continue with their special education services. Where I really get concerned is for Exemption 6, for students who have been previously retained. We don't want to send them on to 4th grade just because they've had a previous exemption and say good luck. We still need to see what's going on. Why is that student still struggling? Yes, they're going to be in 4th grade because we don't really need 16-year-olds sitting in an elementary school classroom. But at the same time, we really need to be saying what's happening and why is this child still struggling and what is it that we need to do. Perhaps the child has been moving around a lot and that's part of the problem. So the intervention might not be academic, the intervention might be around attendance. Some of those types of issues, so that we do need to. So please go back over good cause exemptions, specifically number 6. So good cause exemption 1, I'm just going to go quickly over them, is for students who are EL students that have had less than 2 years instruction in EL program. Exemption 2 are for IEP students that take the OAP or the Oklahoma Alternate Assessment Program. Exemption 3 would be for students who take an alternate reading test such as the ITBS, the SAT-10, or the Terra Nova. Exemption 4 are for students who are showing grade level reading through a teacher-created portfolio, and the requirements for that portfolio can be found on the RSA Coordinator website. Exemption 5 are for students who are on an IEP that take the regular state test, the OSTP, and if they are making gains on their goals, or their IEP goals, then they are exempt. That it will be new this coming year that they did not have to be retained earlier. Exemption 6, which is what you're specifically asking about, are for students who do not have an IEP and have been retained once, are now exempt. That is a change from having been previously retained twice. And please remember that retention in pre-K, when it's for academic reasons, or a transitional class count as a retention. And then finally, Exemption 7 is for exceptional emergency issues, and that would have to be applied for through the district testing coordinator and approved by the Office of Assessment. I'll wait just a minute and see if we have any other questions that come up on the chat box. What subtests are required for DIBELS next? If you would please go on the RSA coordinator page and click on, if you are doing the DIBELS Next paper pencil through Voyager or Dynamic Measurement Group, click on Acadience. If you are doing the online version with Amplify Learning, it would be DIBELS 8, MClass DIBELS 8. If you will click on that link, it will show which subtests are there, because I just don't really remember them all off the top of my head. We have recorded this session, and once we get this out, we will put the link to the slides as well as the recording on the RSA page so that you'll have this. I've had several emails this week saying, can we have this so that we can show staff or reading specialists, and we certainly want to make sure that you have that available. Ginger, your question, this change is good cause exemption 6 for students entering 4th grade. No, those changes did not go into effect until July 1, so they affect this year's group of 3rd graders. They did not affect last year's group of 3rd graders. So for students under, for exemption 5 or 6, that those changes, if you have an IEP student that have not been retained this last year, you can promote them, but through a committee student reading proficiency team. So, Leanne, again, on the cut scores for MAP, again, if you'll go to the technical guidance that we talked about previously on the RSA coordinator page, I've listed all of those scores for each different test. So, STAR reading test, does it have to be timed? Kathy, you'll want to make sure you look at your technical guidance. Forgive me, some of the tests have a timing requirement, some do not. I will try, if you'll send that to me, Kathy, in an email, I'll try to look on the technical guidance and just double check to let you know. So. Alrighty, so I think we'll stop there. We'll look through. If there's any other questions that come up, we'll certainly send those out, or you can send me an email and I'll just send you a quick answer on that. You guys have a great Friday, a wonderful weekend, and for those of you that are just starting school, I hope it's going well. Thank you.